Dear God, bless my words. Give us hope. Amen. Okay, so you probably didn't hear much of the reading on Zechariah because of the squeaky shoes. How many of you even knew that there was a book in the Bible called Zechariah? Okay, so about half of you. How many of you have studied the book of Zechariah? Okay, all right. Well, it's in your pew Bible, and if you want to read along as I'm preaching, you can do that. Look at the words. Zechariah is what's people who categorize things in the Bible. It's a book that is considered a minor prophet. Zechariah is considered a minor prophet, but he's also a very important. This text is a very important text if what you are looking at is how the people of God dealt with desolation and destruction. This is a text that was shared and circulated among people who had lost their homeland through battle. Their homeland had been burned, their temple desecrated. They had no home. It is an apocalyptic text. Now, when I say apocalyptic, you may not know what in the world that means. You may think of it in terms of a zombie movie. But what apocalyptic means technically is a revealing or a disclosure. It's a text that is a revelation about the time. And in many of these biblical texts that are considered apocalyptic, it is a text about a time of desolation with a word of hope for the future. But that word of hope for the future is not an incremental progress towards some end, but an expectation of cataclysmic hope, a cataclysmic resolution to something that is horrifying. Okay, so see, if I were teaching a class, I'd ask if anybody has questions at this point, but I'm preaching, so I can't do that. I'm a better teacher than I am a preacher, but we'll keep going. All right, so I'm going to tell you a story on myself. I'm going to tell a couple of stories on myself, but here's one. I'm 55 years old, and when I was about 20, I came before the board made up of laity, a committee made up of people who are not clergy and people who are clergy in West Texas they were to decide whether or not I could move forward as a candidate for becoming a minister. So it was in like Cross Plains, Texas, maybe Coleman, Texas, maybe Brady, Texas. I don't remember exactly which small town we were in, but people had gathered to meet with candidates for ordination. And one of the women who was not a minister, she was one of the lay leaders, is the term that we use for people who are not clergy, but who are leading, like Mark. She asked me what the biggest challenge to my faith was. And this would have been about, well, let's do the math. It would have been about 1989, somewhere around there. And I told the committee that the biggest challenge to my faith was that I would look outside into the beauty of the Southwest, and all I could see was its imminent destruction. That with each daily notation of a beautiful flower, I would also think, but is that flower going to survive the apocalypse? There were two reasons for this, and I'll get into this, but one of the reasons was if you were growing up politically aware in the 1980s, the movie Dr. Strangelove was not a ha-ha. We were living through the Reagan era, and Prince's song, Party Like It's 1999, that was my generation's expectation, was that we were going to be lucky to survive the Reagan era. My mother had me watch the movie Giant. Do any of you know what I'm talking about? It's the movie Giant has, it's James Dean's last movie, I believe. It has, it's Rock Hudson and Liz Taylor get married, and Elizabeth Taylor, I don't remember where she's from in the movie, but she's not from Texas. And they drive out to his ranch where she is to be the woman of the ranch. And as they are driving, it looks like they are driving to Mars. Now, for me, I was like, oh, this is set in my hometown, basically, when I was watching it. But what my mother said was, and I was maybe 8, she said, you need to understand, this is how the world works. If it's not about oil, it's about something like oil. This is how power works. Zechariah is a text in which the worst has happened. The people of God have been exiled. They are in Babylon. That is not a metaphor. Well, it is a metaphor, but it's become a metaphor. But in this text, it's not a metaphor. God's people have been put out of their homeland. Their homeland has been destroyed. The fall of Jerusalem is a euphemistic phrase. It literally had been destroyed by armies. One way to think about this is that Babylon has come to be known as a kind of metaphor for like being under a giant boot. To be under Babylon is to be under a boot. So think of it that way. So the rescue of God's people must be as biblical, meaning as out of human control and breaking into time, breaking into human time. The phrase that is often in the Bible is the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord will come. At the day of the Lord, things will be made right. The chariots that have destroyed God's people will be cut off. There are many biblical images of the day of the Lord, but one of them is there will be no more war making. There is a current First Nations Anishinaabe, I think I maybe not be saying that exactly right, a First Nations writer, producer named Jesse Wente, who in one of the interviews I listened to with him, the people were asking him about what his perspective and his other First Nations colleagues, what their perspective was on climate change and the sense that doom, the sense of impending doom. And he said, we are a people who've already lived through the apocalypse. We are a people who've already lived through the destruction of everything that we cared about. So now what? It was a scene-shifting answer to their question, and you could hear that the interviewers did not know what to say next. The apocalypse had already happened. So now what? One way to think about the text of Zechariah is to consider it a text shared among people who had lived through the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. Survivors of a massacre. What can be done? What will God do? One of my colleagues who is, he teaches in England, named Nicholas Adams, posted, he writes on Facebook, I don't know, I think you can access his Facebook page even without becoming friends with him. He writes these different theological musings on Facebook, and this particular one really struck me. He was writing about the idea that God is in control, and he was asking questions about what kind of God are people seeking when they ask the question, do you believe that God is in control? And part of what he sorts out in that just one kind of set of musings is, what are people looking for when they ask if God is in control? For me, I grew up in a place where there was no illusion that God was in control in a discernible way. It just wasn't there. We were trying to be farmers in a desert, literally, right? West Texas, it doesn't make sense to grow anything in West Texas except cactus. And that's what we were trying to do. People were trying to graze cattle with very sparse anything on the ground to eat. And we also were living through, in the 1980s, the banking crash in Texas. So if you don't know about the banking crash, in my little girl ears, I heard the word OPEC, the acronym OPEC, over and over and over again in church. We prayed for rain, and we prayed for a change in oil prices, because the change in oil prices affected everybody. And people I knew who had lived through multiple different destructions, including the destruction wrought that even made Texas into Texas, people who had lived through that, when everything crashed in Texas economically in the 1980s, we had, oh my gosh, 4 that I knew of, men who had been involved in ranching, banking, and this isn't like big bank, this is, Texas Bank, but who died in ways that their children and the whole region knew were by their own hands, but in ways that made it not seem exactly that. So we knew people whose lives had been destroyed because there was not even work on the, what are those rigs called? Wasn't even work servicing the jackrabbit. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? The rigs that go like this? Yeah. Yeah.
Oil pumps.
The oil pumps, yeah. The television show that kept going through my head as I was thinking about trying to explain how apocalypse hits me in terms of the region I grew up in is the show Dallas. Now, some of you will have never seen the show Dallas. I only saw a few episodes of the show Dallas. One of the little boys I babysat loved the show Dallas so much that I had to watch it with him. He called it Jockey because the grandfather of the Ewing family's name was Jock, and obviously the little boy had really fixated on that one character. But the show Dallas can be used as a way to think about the period during which people who made their living by oil were reckoning with their loss of power, reckoning with being Babylon. So Dallas is Babylon. San Angelo, where I grew up, was kind of a suburb of Babylon. But people who'd been the boot, people who had been the boot under which people were dealing, realizing that they were losing control. Jock Ewing in the series Dallas dies. The actor actually died, and then they had to figure out how to tell the story. He dies in Venezuela. Did anybody remember that part? He dies in a jungle in Venezuela looking for oil that the United States can commandeer to save the oil industry. It is actually a show about geopolitics as much as it is a show about who's having sex with whom, which I didn't remember. But listening to an analysis by an economist, a historian and economist named, her name is Helen Thompson, and I want to read to you from a few things that she wrote. Give me 1 second. So one of the things she wrote was that for much of the 20th century in Europe, so she's writing about like the way, she's a historian, she's an economist and a historian of petrochemicals. That's her specialty. And she was analyzing the show Dallas to help teach people about how we got to where we are with our current crisis. For much of the 20th century in Europe, politicians and government quite clearly took the inescapability of energy questions for politics as axiomatic. What she means there is that petrochemicals were an assumption, like people talked about it in polite company. And this is a quote that she's pulled from 20th century Europe. Quote, "The kingdom of heaven runs on righteousness," declared Ernest Bevin during a heated argument in the British Parliament over a distasteful decision in the Middle East. Quote, "But the kingdom of earth runs on oil." The kingdom of earth runs on oil. So if Dallas is the center of Texas in the 1980s, and Texas is, the Bush family. If Texas is a center for geopolitics in the world, Dallas is one way to think about the world. Helen Thompson goes on to talk about how during the airing of the show, there were two different dynamics going on that are very much tied to the environmental movement. One is the destruction of the soil, the destruction of the land, but it was around this period that people started talking about the possible destruction of the cosmos, the possible destruction of the atmosphere. Some of you lived through this, right? Some of you lived through the period during which we were talking about the Superfund sites and the destruction of the earth, the soil, such that nothing would grow again. But there was a shift to also recognize what was happening to the planet and the atmosphere around the planet. So getting back to that ordination question, I had a teacher in San Angelo, Texas, the one high school really it was the only high school. We didn't have privates and charters at that time. We do, unfortunately, now in West Texas. But at the time, we all went to school together. And we had one biology teacher who we all had to pass through, and his name was Mr. Price. And Mr. Price was a veteran. I don't know of which war. I couldn't find that information before this sermon, but I think the Korean War. And Mr. Price, in addition to teaching us all the different kinds of critters, all the different kinds of non-human animals, reminded us at least every week that the building we were in had asbestos. He reminded us at least once a week that we were sitting in a room with poison. And he reminded our little 15-year-old selves that apparently no one cared enough to come and fix that so that we could be safe. He also was already teaching us in 1984, it would have been about 1984, 1985, he was already teaching us about climate change at that time. He was already teaching us about the ways that the chemicals that we use were destroying our very air, the air that we breathe. We would sit there, some of us, this was before cell phones, so we didn't have a way to check out, like, by putting in earphones. So some of my colleagues, some of my friends, we would just kind of check out by passing notes to each other about something, anything, who was having sex with whom, so that we didn't have to think about the themes he was putting in front of us in terms of geopolitics. And part of what he was teaching us as a veteran was don't count on any of the elected officials actually to care about you. It's a bleak word. Don't get it twisted, he would teach us. The Democrats are in the back pocket of the oil industry. Or is that the way the metaphor goes? The Democrats are also beholden to petrochemicals. So just know that. Because you people, he would tell us, you people, you're going to have to come up with a different form of political realism than we've got going on right now. That's part of what got me to age 20 saying, I don't know how to look at a jackrabbit and not wonder if the jackrabbit's going to make it. It's a bleak way to see the world, but it was realistic. It was realistic. Don't expect the politicians to care after the race massacre of 1921. Don't expect the politicians to save the First Nations. So what? What are our responses as Christians? What is our response? I'm gonna tell you some of my responses, and maybe they'll resonate with some of you. So one of the responses I lean on is individual responsibility. So one of the responses I lean on is that I can I'll show you one right now. I can bring a mug so that I'm not using a water bottle. Does that make a smidgen of difference? No, but it feels good. It feels good when I remember my reusable bags. It's a little symbol that I care, but meanwhile, I've got so many friends who don't have time for that. And also, by the way, the reusable bags take up a lot more of the environment to make than the little plastic bags. If you didn't know that, that's a fun one to look up. But that's one of the ways we manage, some of us, is we figure out some way to use reusable straws to save the ocean. Mr. Price's voice, as a prophet in West Texas, tells me, look at Duke Power. Look at Duke Power. Don't look at the individual straws. Look at Duke Power. You don't have to go to British Petroleum. You can just look at Duke Power. But this is easier. This helps me keep my job. Another response is a way to think about God being in control that is soothing but not terribly true, okay? Not terribly realistic. So there are no kids in here, right? No, there are no children in here. Okay, so since there are no and if there are children on Zoom, I'm about to say something that's kind of scary. I've already said lots of scary stuff, but I'll now tell something else scary. So I was dressing Gigi the other day, and songs that I didn't even know were in my head will come up as I'm singing to my granddaughter. And I just started singing, so rise and shine and give God the glory, glory, rise and shine. Anybody know it? Give God the glory, glory, rise and shine, and give God the glory, glory, children of the Lord. It's the story of Noah's Ark. And so the Lord said to Noah, build him an arky. And then the sun came out and dried up the landy land. And as I'm singing it, I mean, Gigi doesn't understand exactly what I'm saying, right? She's only 18 months. I will get over doing this by the time she's able to understand me. But I'm singing, the sun came out and dried up the landy land, and all the corpses that did not make it on the ark were there. And this is really a scary story, children of the Lord. Those little songs work fine until they start reading the Bible. It's a scary story. It's a scary story. Give God the glory, glory. How? And then there's just flat out denial. When I hear about climate change deniers, I'm like, you know what? Sign me up. I'll deny it. That's what I'm doing. There's a part of me that has to do that, to get up in the morning and not worry about every bluebird I see. But there's another way I'm working towards, okay, y'all? I'm working towards this way. I'm working to try to have a combination of hope and courage that expects a cataclysm, expects that God will provide, but not in any way I'm able to reckon or figure or plan for. There's a theologian who I turn to named Karl Barth, B-A-R-T-H, and Karl Barth lived through Nazi Germany. He lived under the occupation of Switzerland, and he also lived through his own nation, Switzerland, making money off of World War II through banking, right? So he'd not only lived through the Nazis, but he'd lived through the men in power in Switzerland making hay off of the Holocaust. He'd lived through all that and kept writing, and one of the themes of his writing, this is a fancy phrase, but it's useful, is eschatological realism. Eschatological meaning, the term means like the end times. A realism that is born daily from the belief that we don't always have, but we hope to have, that God actually will make things right. To quote from my sermon 2 weeks ago, that Pharaoh's army will be drowned and thrown a lifeboat and taught how not to keep building chariots. Eschatological realism. That's what I'm trying to live into, even while reckoning with the reality that Democrats and Republicans in the state seem to be in some giant back pocket, different back pockets maybe, but the men with big pockets spread it around. So how to have courage born of hope that the cataclysm, the day of the Lord, will be a blessing, not a curse, to God's people. Living into the possibility that we can truly be not afraid. May it be so. May God bless us with a word that truly revives. Whew, and it is hot. But may the days of heat not be a sign of the apocalypse for you. If you're watching MSNBC on a regular basis, basically every hot day we're supposed to be reminded that the world is ending, and I just don't know how to live that way. So figure out a different way, that when it's hot, don't say to your neighbor, well, you know, we're all going under. It's not helpful. Invite somebody to dinner instead, because we'll be having community dinner soon. Invite somebody to come help hand out food, and continue to pray for hope. And now, let us sing.